Good afternoon, everyone. In recognition of Black History Month, the Asian American Bar Association Civil Rights Committee, in collaboration with the Charles Houston Bar Association, presents today's panel, No One is Free Until We Are All Free, a discussion on AAPI-Black Solidarity in Fighting Racial Injustice. My name is Mari Bandoma Collado. I am a senior associate attorney and serve as a director of DE&I at the Dolan Law Firm. I am one of the co-chairs of the AAPI CRC alongside Kevin Benedicto and Pavanpreet Dhaliwal. I will be your moderator today. Before we get started, Pavanpreet will be sharing some CLE information.
Hi, everyone. My name is Pavanpreet Dhaliwal, and I'm one of the co-chairs for the Civil Rights Committee. We're glad to have you at this event today. This event is eligible for 1 hour of California Elimination of Bias MCLE credit. This event is recorded and will be made available to all registered attendees. Please sign in for this event by clicking the link in the chat. You will also be able to find links to the written materials, an evaluation form, and the event registration form. AAPI will only send certificates of attendance to registered attendees. If you've not yet registered, please register on AAPI's website at the link in the video description. And now I'll turn it back over to Mari.
Thank you, Pavanpreet, and to the Education Committee. It's my pleasure to introduce Deborah Moss-West, who co-organized this panel with us on behalf of the Charles Houston Bar Association. Deborah is the executive director of the Alexander Community Law Center at Santa Clara University School of Law. She's a certified professional coach and a board member of CHBA.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the AAPI-Black Solidarity panel. My name is Deborah Moss-West, as mentioned, and I bring you greetings from the Charles Houston Bar Association. We first want to thank the Asian American Bar Association Civil Rights Committee, and in particular, Mari, for organizing this event. This session is meant to provide an overview with information and resources that will challenge us to do our own research, identify where we might help, and then move forward together. As the event title says, no one is free until we are all free. First, we'll hear about the history of the Asian American movement and how solidarity with the Black liberation struggle was foundational to the movement. The panelists will then share historical and contemporary examples of effective allyship with Black and AAPI communities, working in concert to fight in the fight for racial justice. We also know that even though there has been great solidarity, there's also been and continues to be some tension between the two communities. Thus, we'll learn about an effective tool for strengthening AAPI-Black solidarity. Restorative justice, which has historically been used in the criminal justice context, can be a dispute resolution tool that emphasizes repairing harms by bringing folks together in a common quest for truth, healing, and reconciliation. So we'll talk about how that tool might be useful for us here. Lastly, the panelists will offer reflections on how Black and AAPI communities can move forward together in solidarity, bringing power. I look forward to learning from the panel today. Gosh, I'm getting a little tongue-tied. I think that's happening because I'm just full today with the recent nomination of President Biden, the Supreme Court nominee of Ketanji Brown Jackson. Again, I'm not going to say more. I'm not speaking today, but my heart is just full, and I'm glad that we're continuing to move forward in that space. So please sit back. Thank you for joining us today, and God bless.
Thank you again, Deborah, and to the Charles Houston Bar Association. Now, before we introduce our speakers, I would like to thank the Minority Bar Coalition, who provided us with a platform to invite so many organizations to co-sponsor this panel. We received an overwhelming response and support, and I think that speaks volumes about the importance of having these types of conversations and really focus on collaboration between our organizations. To our co-sponsors, thank you so much for your support. We have ACBA, SF ABODA, APABA SV, Bay Area Lawyer Chapter of the American Constitution Society, Bailiff, Black Women Lawyers Association of Northern California, California Association of Black Lawyers, California Lawyers Association, CALOBA, CEOC's DE&I Committee, Contra Costa County Bar Association, East Bay La Raza Lawyers Association, FBank, Iranian American Bar Association, Northern California Chapter, MCBA, Queens Bench Bar Association of the Bay Area, Region 9 of the National Bar Association, Santa Clara County Bar Association, Santa Clara County Black Lawyers Association, and the South Asian Bar Association of Northern California. We are so honored to have an incredible group of speakers today. First, we have Dr. Robin Magalit Rodriguez, a full professor of Asian American Studies at UC Davis. She was the first Pinay to serve as chair in the department's 50-year history. She is also the founding director of the Bulusan Center for Filipino Studies, the only research education center based at a major university focused on the Filipinx experience in the United States and the diaspora in the entire country. Dr. Rodriguez is a scholar activist who has worked to fight white supremacy and advance racial justice longer than she has researched and written about it. She helped to found and currently serves as the interim board chair for the newly launched Asian American Liberation Network in the Greater Sacramento region and has published extensively on Asian American activism. Her latest anthology, co-edited with Dr. Diane Fogino, just came out from the University of Washington Press and is entitled Contemporary Asian American Activism, Building Movements for Liberation. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Rodriguez.
Thank you so much, Mari, for the introduction and also for the invitation to all the organizers. Really, I'm really pleased to be here.
We also have Professor Margaret M. Russell, a member of the Santa Clara University School of Law faculty since 1990 and is affiliated with the university's Center for Social Justice and Public Service, the Markula Center for Applied Ethics, and the Center of Multicultural Learning. She has been honored for her contributions to student life at Santa Clara by the Asian Pacific Law Students Association and the Black Law Students Association. In 1991, she traveled to South Africa with a delegation of legal scholars to provide consultation on constitution drafting for the post-apartheid transition. Prior to joining Santa Clara Law faculty, she was a fellow at the public interest firm Public Advocates, Inc. in San Francisco. She served as director of public interest programs and as the acting assistant dean of student affairs at Stanford University, and also clerked for the Honorable James Doyle of the U.S. District Court in Madison, Wisconsin. Welcome, Professor Russell. Last but certainly not least, we have Arthi Kohli, the executive director of the Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus, the first organization in the country to represent and promote the legal and civil rights of Asian and Pacific Islander communities. Arthi leads ALC with a vision of increasing the power of low-income immigrant communities to help advance economic and racial justice in our democracy. She currently leads a national table of Asian American leaders addressing anti-Asian hate with a focus on policy, messaging, and solidarity work. Arthi is committed to advancing local, state, and federal policy solutions that recognize and address the needs of Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. She is an experienced leader with over 20 years of experience working at the intersections of immigration, civic engagement, criminal justice, economic equity, and national security. Thank you so much, Arthi, for being here. All right, Dr. Rodriguez is going to kick us off with a quick overview of the Asian American movement and how solidarity with the Black liberation struggle was foundational to the Asian American movement.
Thanks again, Mari. I think I was kind of chomping at the bit earlier. So excited to be here. Thank you all who organized and co-sponsored the event. So I wanted to speak about the Asian American movement for this event first, because as a scholar of Asian American studies, I know that even in the field, research and publishing on the Asian American movement is still emergent and not as developed as it should be. Second, given the fact that ethnic studies as a field of study is not offered in most colleges and universities across the country, very few people have much knowledge of it to begin with. And of course, with the fight to make CRT or critical race theory illegal, this knowledge is going to be even harder to access. Now, third, and most importantly, I want to speak about the Asian American movement because I think it's vital to understand that to claim Asian American is not merely to claim some census designation. To claim Asian American is not merely a descriptor of our shared ancestry on the continent of Asia. To claim Asian American, especially if we connect the term to the Asian American movement of the late 1960s, is to claim a collective political identity that already resists anti-blackness and is oppositional to its very core to white supremacy. I think it's important for us to understand and appreciate the lessons of the Asian American movement as we continue the work of liberation. Today, I'll be drawing extensively from my recently published anthology, which not only includes insights from scholar activists, but from on-the-ground community organizers. I don't have slides, but I've got a prop. The book, thank you. The Asian American movement was a nationwide social movement that, for the first time, centered large-scale Pan-Asian organizing across multiple cities and regions. The Asian American movement was primarily a youth-based movement, but also spanned across the generations. Activist struggles took place on college campuses, in urban Chinatowns, little Tokyos and Manila towns, and in rural communities. The very term Asian American originated in the Asian American movement. It was, as scholar Yenli Espiritu argues, a political strategy to resist anti-Asian racism rather than a concept seeking to unify diverse cultures, histories, languages, and religions. I can't emphasize enough the political nature of Asian American identity. While the Asian American movement shaped a social identity consciousness as Asian Americans, the concept and movement simultaneously embraced Pan-Asian and Third World political formations. The Asian American movement was inseparable from its political milieu and strongly influenced by Black power nationally and Third World anti-colonialism internationally. And this includes the kinds of solidarities taking place in Asia and Africa, manifesting, for example, in the Bandung Conference of 1955. Now, by the late 1960s and 1970s, the politics of revolutionary nationalism combined with internationalism among Black, Puerto Rican, Chicanx, Chicano and Chicana, Indigenous and Asian American radicals, such that activist struggles for the liberation for one's own community could coexist with the decolonial demand for liberation for all oppressed people. The Asian American Political Alliance, for example, which started at Berkeley in May 1968 and expanded nationwide, issued a document that claimed self-determination for Asian Americans and all oppressed people, documenting the influence of the Black Panther Party and Black Power's call for self-determination. Most of the iconic images of the Asian American movement show the influence of Black Power on Asian American politics. This includes the Life magazine photograph of Yuri Kochiyama trying to comfort her dear friend and comrade, the slain Malcolm X, on the stage of the Audubon Ballroom. The militant image of Richard Aoki, an early Japanese American member of the Black Panther Party, donned in beret, sunglasses, and Asian American Political Alliance button, and images of Asian American activists with signs reading, "The yellow peril supports Black Power." Today's organizers build on the knowledge and material changes gained in the 1960s and 70s, as well as in the lesser known Asian American struggles of the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, whether they're conscious of it or not. Now, in our book, we highlight the importance of intergenerational knowledge to make more visible the ways the present builds on the Asian American movement's core orientations and organizing practices of the past, and can continue to be important in informing our visions and strategies for the future. Now, intergenerational continuity is not necessarily a given. Most Asian American activists in the late 1960s were isolated from the earlier genealogy of Filipino, Korean, Chinese, or Japanese American struggles. These histories had been nearly erased for the Asian American generation through World War II, constraints on earlier Japanese immigrant radicalism, the Cold War repression of the Chinese immigrant left, the early Cold War repositioning of Asian Americans into integrated workplaces and suburbs, and the post war creation of the model minority myth that concealed Asian American radicalism and anti Asian racism. But through their organizing, Asian American activists, Asian American movement activists came to learn about early Asian American struggles. When Asian American activists fought the international hotel evictions of the Filipino and Chinese elderly tenants in San Francisco, they learned from the Mano or elder residents about a history of Filipino farm worker organizing. Through their organizing in Chinatowns, as well as to dismantle Title II of the 1950 McCarran Act, which allowed for the detention of anyone deemed subversive without the need for evidence. Asian American movement activists learned about the McCarthy era repression of the Chinese left. When Karen Ishizuka, author of Serve the People and other West Coast senseis, visited Yuri Kochiyama in New York, they learned about a radical Nisei past. This was tremendously important. It allowed Asian American activists to recuperate intergenerational knowledge and connections to their past in ways that shape their own identities and political struggles. Now, compared to the still rather limited knowledge of pre-1960s Asian American activism, especially outside of labor and citizenship struggles, the Asian American movement has been much better studied and circulated in large part because of the establishment of Asian American studies, which itself is a victory of the Asian American movement. And yet, even still, that's not, we don't have enough work on the Asian American movement. Now, as a result of the ongoing work of Asian American studies, Asian American young people today often know something, if often in just a very cursory way, about Asian American icons or Asian American movement icons like Yuri Kochiyama, Grace Lee Boggs, or Philip Veracruz, or about struggles around ethnic studies, the International Hotel, or Vincent Chin, or possibly Asian American movement organizations like the Asian American Political Alliance, or Asian Americans for Action, or East Wind, or the KDP, the Katipunan ng Demokratikong Pilipino. And movement elders have also played a vital role, in addition to Asian American studies, in transferring knowledge and mentoring younger generations of activists. Yelders, a term that Alex T. Tom, one of our contributors, uses to refer to younger elders like himself and even me, whose activism began in the 1980s and 1990s, have also been important activist mentors to young people today and are serving to bridge knowledge and organizing practices across the three most active periods of Asian American activism, the 1960s and 70s, the 90s, and the present. We also center in our book this intergenerational perspective, and this is really important for today, because in today's culture, there is a tendency towards a presentist perspective, as noted by Scott Nakagawa, a seasoned organizer and artist who has decades of experience in fighting against vigilante white supremacist groups and authoritarian evangelical political movements. That is, to presentism or being presentist is that in the age of Instagram and the instantaneous posting, commenting, and sharing that come with social media, we tend to always think in the present tense. Things that are not now seem to be easily dismissed and old and irrelevant. While social media has played an important role in engaging younger generations in the struggle to challenging both anti-Blackness and white supremacy, it's so vital to understand our Asian American movement lineage. I believe rooting our sense of Asian Americanness and the Asian American movement is vital because there are ways that Asian American identity is also being weaponized in ways that serve white supremacist agendas and duplicitously misappropriate the language of the Black civil rights struggles, as in the fight to eliminate affirmative action in admissions to Harvard University and the support for Chinese American New York police officer Peter Liang in the murder of Akai Gurley by the NYPD. In conclusion, I want to share an insight from movement elder Pam Tao Lee, who calls us to subscribe to a vision of radical love. Radicalism, which is often ascribed many negative connotations, but radical is defined as forming at the root. And thus, as we take on this work to fight anti-Blackness, we must understand it is rooted in white supremacy and concomitantly settler colonialism, imperialism, racial capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and other structures of domination. At the same time, let's not forget that what we're building are the necessary institutional and cultural changes we want in the world. We want to be rooted in love, radical love, love for each other, and ultimately love for the earth. And with that, I'll end. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rodriguez. I was an ethnic studies major at Cal, and I still continue to learn so much from you. So I really appreciate that. I wanted to ask both of you, we'll start with Professor Russell, about sharing some examples of effective allyship between the AAPI and the Black communities. Oh, you're still on mute, Professor Russell.
Thank you very much. And that was a wonderful address. Thank you so much, Dr. Rodriguez. I wanted to start by acknowledging that there is a long history, that rather than being presentist and seeing the language today, which pits the AAPI community and the Black community against one another, that we can look back in history and see the commonalities and support for each other. The Japanese American internment, which I think it resulted in several cases, including Fred Korematsu's, that went up to the US Supreme Court and was decided wrongly in the early 1940s. There were supporters among Black leadership who were opposing the Japanese American internment, even at a time when there was such rife racism and targeting of Japanese Americans that they were not thought to be American at all. So I think that is a good example. Also, Dr. Rodriguez talked about the civil rights movement. I think people who came of age in that period, meaning the 60s and 70s, perhaps as young adults growing up, the notion of solidarity and coalition was really the backbone of moving forward. I think that is lost today in a number of ways because there's such manipulation of language, I think, to try to heighten differences between the two communities when we actually have so much commonality in terms of history of racial subordination in this country.
How about you, Dr. Rodriguez?
Yeah, thank you. You know, I actually want to kind of distinguish between allyship and solidarity. I think that's really important, and I don't know that I can share. I was going to share, but I'm not sure that how to actually do that. A really, really great piece, an op-ed in Color Lines, and hopefully folks can find it. Solidarity and Allyship: A Call to the AAPI Community by Sung-Yun Chaimoro. This was actually published in 2020, but I think it's vital. So I guess I'll speak in two ways. So on one hand, I think that you know, there is so much work that's being done in terms of solidarity. I think what's fantastic is, despite the fact that there are so many, I think, among the younger generations that don't quite know this history, I think the reality is that the Asian American movement has had enduring influence. It created a whole range of institutions, including even the field of Asian American studies. And I think a lot of the sensibilities of younger folks who may not necessarily be fully cognizant of like those connections back to this kind of 50-year plus history, I think that's definitely kind of shaping how folks are approaching solidarity work. And by solidarity work, I mean, we can name lots of amazing organizations that kind of emerged, especially even before the brutal murder of George Floyd, but there's been a growing movement of chapters of, say, for example, the Asians for Black Lives. And I think what's great about their work is I think they display solidarity. And when I think about solidarity, I think about solidarity as being both in standing and opposing anti-Blackness and recognizing that white supremacy works and operates through our lives. And to be in solidarity for me is a kind of connectivity and commitment to liberation that I think runs far deeper than allyship. And I feel like for allyship, while equally important, we do have to reckon, and I think for me, I think about allyship as the kind of work when, when kind of Asian Americans are trying to struggle with their elders, say, although, I think it's always a mischaracterization to think that all the elders somehow are, kind of have some sort of harbor anti-Black feelings. I mean, but I do think that kind of work of sort of addressing our relative privilege vis-a-vis Black folks, or grappling with anti-Blackness in our communities, all of that is really important. But again, when we miss that other piece, which I think is really tackling white supremacy, tackling the root causes of anti-Blackness, then I feel like we're not, excuse me, going as deep as we can towards the project of liberation. So, just kind of naming that. But there's so many wonderful examples. I mean, we have a whole bunch in the book and some previous, work that we've done together, my mentor, Diane Fugino, and I. And we see it on the streets all the time. I mean, also, too, just to quickly say, our communities are also changing. We have also incredible, a whole range of biracial, multiracial, Black and Asian young people who also, I think they live in their very DNAs, a very particular kind of experience, and they're also leading us on helping us to better understand that, solidarity requires certain kinds of engagement, this kind of intersectional analysis. And so, I think that there's all this amazing work that's being done in social justice organizations all over the place. And, again, so I'll just kind of. Mari, you were on mute.
Thank you. I was saying that let's bring up Arthi Kohli next. She is at the Asian Law Caucus, which is the first Asian American legal and civil rights organization that has really fought for and continues to fight for justice and equality, and in solidarity with Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities. Can you give us some examples of the initiatives that ALC is working on in solidarity with the Black liberation movement?
Yeah, and first of all, thank you for having me here today. This is a really important discussion. And I want to just affirm that it's always been really clear to us that the systems that we're challenging have been often created and rooted in anti-Blackness. And in fact, the first case that we had at ALC was San Francisco Police Department decided to go after Chinese gangs in 1972. And so they committed street sweeps, picking up any young Asian man who was standing on the street. And it was clear then, and it's clear now to us that, we were not the only community being targeted by the police. And in fact, the police had targeted Black communities for far longer. And the solutions we sought in that case were systemic solutions, were not just for our communities, but all communities who were being racially discriminated against and over-policed. And so, just the fact that the founding case was that, I think informs us to this day, the work we do. So some of the, and I know we're pretty short on time, so I'll just give, brief descriptions of some of our current work. But one of the big things we're working on is separating local police, state and local law enforcement from ICE. And we have, in that work, a lot of our clients are Southeast Asians, but also Black immigrants. And so these are folks who are incarcerated, and then as a result of that, of being formerly incarcerated, then face deportation. And through this work, I personally have come to learn about all the ways that our criminal justice system is dysfunctional. We have, advocated on behalf of a Black immigrant who was incarcerated because of she's a survivor of sexual violence, and was being held responsible for the actions of her abuser. And so, we absolutely, focus on fighting against the deportation for our clients, but we know that we actually need to dismantle the dysfunctions within the criminal justice system. So we can't do this work just focused on the immigration piece. We actually have to work on the criminal justice piece, and that has to be done in solidarity with impacted communities. The other more recent work we've been doing in terms of building power is work on redistricting and voting. So if you're aware of the data, communities of color, API, Black communities, Latinx communities tend to vote. Their voter turnout is lower than white communities. And in addition, there is often challenges in getting representation. So through the redistricting process in California, we worked really closely with the Black Redistricting Hub, with MALDEF, with Latinx groups as well, together and identify the values that we have, the shared values of making sure that low-income communities of color get representation. And so while we were advocating for AAPI community representation, we were very mindful that we needed to do this in partnership with Black and Latinx communities as well. And so those were, that's been work that's, months of meetings and conversations and relationship building. And I think that's what, when we're talking about solidarity and allyship, a lot of this has to do with the time and effort that we spend with each other in building relationship, understanding the needs of our respective communities.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I know part of ALC's commitment is also addressing anti-Blackness in our own AAPI communities. And I think Dr. Rodriguez alluded a little bit as to that aspect of making sure that you're part of, in terms of what's the difference between solidarity and allyship. Can you share with us some more information about that work? And if Dr. Rodriguez has anything to add about, working on anti-Blackness in our own communities, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, we come, many of us, from countries where there was colonialism, where anti-Blackness is present, and that colorism has been very prevalent. I'm from India, it's a big issue there. And you're valued for your lighter skin. And people come with bias, and then into a society that is constantly sending you messages, both subtle and not so subtle. And so I think for us, one of our additional challenges is we're the fastest growing immigrant community. And so we have a constant influx of folks coming in. And so I do actually think that ethnic studies is crucial, because we need to educate our youth and our elders about the history of this country, and the fact that the oppression that we're seeing and the targeting that we're seeing, other communities have been sent, were targeted, actually before us. And it is all in a container of white supremacy. And, to say that there is exceptionalism, that we're somehow different and we're, that actually, I think, creates a lot of challenges. We have to understand what we're facing within a construct of what other communities have faced in this country. And so we do that both in discrete ways, where we talk about the work that we're doing with our communities on the ground. And I think we are looking at creating tools of how to have these conversations. And youth in particular have been asking for these tools, because they want to have these conversations at the Thanksgiving, dinner table. And I think, it's been heartening for me as I've been talking to folks, especially after the killing of George Floyd. I've had people of all Asian American generations really acknowledge the systemic targeting of Black Americans, and the fact that 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 gives me hope for what we need to do, which is really to build the solidarity, to build more solidarity between Black and Asian communities.
Yeah, so I know we're sort of, this is a really fulsome conversation that I wish we had more than an hour for, but my next question, and that I will pose to Dr. Rodriguez, is, there's been a lot of coverage on the attacks of AAPIs by Black perpetrators, even though there's no evidence that Black Americans are actually predominantly responsible for the rise in the attacks. I mean, this focus on the relationship between Black and AAPI communities, it's not new, but the attention on Black assailants continue to create a wedge between our communities. I mean, what kind of conversations are organizations having on this topic?
Right. I mean, I think part of it is, again, sort of this work around historicizing this phenomenon, right? This is not, many of us who've lived through, for example, the Los Angeles uprisings know exactly how the media was framing anti kind of Asian Black tensions. Even before that, there were other kinds of issues happening on the East Coast. It's happened again and again and again. And I think, again, I suppose because I'm an educator, I always, do think there is such an incredible value of sharing ethnic studies, and sharing ethnic studies far beyond the university classroom where it's really confined. And so I think a lot of the work that's being done in organizations, certainly the organization I work with locally in my community, the Asian American Liberation Network, it is both kind of for fighting for ethnic studies and disseminating ethnic studies knowledge to our members and our community. Another major way is how we respond to, on one hand, being really empathetic with folks in our community who are afraid of anti-Asian violence, while taking a very firm stance that the response to anti-Asian violence does not have to be more policing. That again, there are ways that we can address anti-Asian violence that don't have to require a violence that will be meted out on our Black brothers and sisters, our Black community members. So that's something that's been really at the core of how we've approached things in the Asian American Liberation Network. And I think that a lot of organizations in the Asian American community have been trying to grapple with it, right? Again, we recognize people have very real fears, there have been real kind of threats and real violence experienced. But again, policing does not have to be the solution. There are other ways to address fundamentally what anti-Asian racism is rooted in.
Arthi, did you want to add something?
Yeah. I think the issue is that there's a breakdown of systems right now. We have, unhoused populations. We've got folks dealing with mental health crises, and we don't have systems to address that. Our only answer is the police. And that actually, the police themselves will tell you they are not equipped to actually be a long-term solution for these deep problems. And the Asian American community is unfortunately at some level being asked to solve these problems, because we are, the trauma, the fear of walking to the grocery store, that is very real, especially for elders. And it's not okay. It's also not okay that Black children are getting murdered in Oakland, and so we're not, we have to create safety. And I feel like it's a failure of government and our imagination in terms of how can we look into creating safety in ways that actually it's long-term. Yeah, you can go arrest an unhoused person and get them off the street for, 48 hours. Is that going to solve the problem? No. And so I know what's hard is what our communities are asking for is an immediate solution. And I get that impetus. I get that. Yeah, okay, I don't have time. I want to see police on my street right now. But that's not going to actually get us where we need to go in the long term. And I think, there are some new programs in San Francisco, community response teams. We've got to look at experimentation and, ways that the communities can come together to actually provide safety, working with government.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I know Dr. Rodriguez has a hard stop at 1 o'clock. So in case we don't get like your last thoughts, maybe I'll give you an opportunity to give your last thoughts now and allow you to go to your 1 o'clock.
Really, I'd love to just be able to kind of hear from our other colleagues. I think that there's some important insights there. But, again, thank you all for being present and for the work that you do and for organizing such an important event.
Thank you. And now that's a great transition. And I think some of the things that Arthi was talking about, I think really falls in line with Professor Russell's presentation on restorative justice and how this approach can be an effective tool for strengthening AAPI-Black solidarity.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for this great conversation. Hold on just a second. I need to close my door. Hi, ambient noise from a fire engine. So restorative justice is actually a wonderful turn when one feels helpless. And certainly in thinking about some of the strongest conflicts that both the AAPI and Black communities face, as well as conflicts among our own communities, restorative justice really was originally discussed and developed through indigenous practices of problem solving, of treating us all really as a family and a village and solving problems by bringing people together, right? Not casting them out. So as this evolved and has been adopted in the American criminal justice system, there are a number of court programs, there are school programs as well, certainly in the prison context. Restorative justice has been adopted to deal with the fact that when there is harm in a community, when there is a victim, but the terminology of victim is less used than it used to be. When there is harm, when there is an offender, and there is a harm to the community. Sometimes the offender has suffered harm themselves. The community needs a level of accountability as well as a way to heal the harm and bring people together. I think this is a terrific model for the AAPI and Black Solidarity movement and efforts. And I just have one slide, which I don't usually get to show in PowerPoints when I'm teaching. So, okay. So these are my parents with my older sister. My parents are both deceased, but they met when my African-American father in the Army sergeant suit was in Yokohama, Japan, stationed there in the late 1940s. And he met my mother, Kimiko, who is living in Japan and from Japan, as is her whole family. So in meeting at that particular time, during or sort of the span of hatred toward Japanese after the war, and then coming back to the United States and going to an Army base in El Paso, Texas, where my father wasn't even allowed to go to movie theaters, but my mother was because of racial hatred against Blacks. I want to borrow a phrase from Dr. Rodriguez and say, yes, a lot of us do have in our DNA a sense of solidarity, identity, a sense of love, which she also mentioned, radical love, from which springs our desire to have harmony. So let me say a little bit about restorative justice, since since many of you are lawyers, and this is increasingly being adopted in the legal system in various contexts, it's defined as a process to involve, to the greatest extent possible, those who have a stake in a specific offense and to collectively identify and address harms, needs, and obligations in order to heal and put things as right as possible. So that's a quote from really the landmark first US book about restorative justice, which is called The Little Book of Restorative Justice by Howard Zehr. He is a leader of the movement. I would also recommend many of the other little books that have come out subsequently, particularly in terms of what we're talking about today, Fania Davis's book, The Little Book of Race and Restorative Justice. And Fania Davis is a lawyer from the East Bay who is tremendously involved in restorative justice for Oakland youth. Let's think about what this might involve. I talked about identity, and it is true that each of us has a different way of identifying ourselves, right? Whether it's racial identity or gender identity, whatever we think actually needs to be put forward in a particular context in order for us to feel equal is important, right? And it doesn't matter which identity. I think Asian American or Black American, I don't really compartmentalize them. What restorative justice does is give us a lens through which we might take our individual identity and actually try to develop some other person's perspective. So in each incidence of anti-Asian violence, certainly there is racial harm, but racial harm exists outside of that context for Asian Americans and others as well. And Black Americans who are, to Arthi's comments, who are having the most debates about policing are recognizing the extent to which policing has been a harm, particularly against African Americans. So identifying harms and not erasing them is tremendously important. And just as an aside, the whole move to develop laws against critical race theory and ethnic studies and discussing race in the classroom can also be seen through a restorative justice process, in that those laws are really trying to erase the language and the concepts by which we can identify racial harms historically and in the present day. And that's tremendously dangerous, in addition to the other harms of censorship. I wanted to explain briefly how, as you might wonder and may have questions, so how do we make this happen? Something that is very important in the restorative justice process is awareness of each other's positionality, harm, and need to be part of community, right? So if you're not a communitarian person, then the idea of solidarity in this context is probably going to be kind of difficult, but it's extremely helpful to think of us really, I think, as a world community, and to use less conventional in the law, less conventional ways of looking at the law. Anybody trained in the law knows that you spend a lot of your time reading cases that's so-and-so versus so-and-so. Versus is always there. And when we put it into this context, it's easy to see how people kind of construct and pit groups against each other. This group is against that. This is versus, right? So restorative justice erases the versus and asks if there are alternative ways of resolving disputes. A popular method, and it does work, it might sound a little unusual for some of you, is to have circle processes. And the idea of the indigenous roots of the circle process is to put everyone on equal ground, to speak honestly, to speak peacefully, and to feel like part of an organic whole, essentially. So before I end, because I know we're running out of time, I would just note that this is This has been kind of a beginning of a circle process between our organizations. I'm very excited about it. I think there need to be more. We certainly live in a multiracial area of the country, thank goodness. And we have many opportunities to meet people and talk with people who do not have our racial identity, gender identity, and many other identities. So by explicitly putting out front the need to see ourselves as a community that is accountable to the harm to any one of us, we can move one step closer to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Russell. The materials that we provided, the written materials, show some more of the long history of solidarity between the AAPI and Black communities. And, you know, as you heard from today, you know, fostering these relationships is needed, you know, and it's so important to have these discussions about our collective struggle. So I really hope this panel gave you a better understanding of how to move forward through solidarity. And I look forward to many more collaborations between all our organizations in fighting racial injustice. I want to give it back to Arthi, Professor Russell, or Dr. Rodriguez, if anyone has any last closing thoughts or words before we end today.
Oh, I was hoping there would be some questions or comments, but since lawyers, I think, and people for getting CLE credit for this, you know, are kind of results oriented. Okay, what's our next step? I guess, you know, I will ask just kind of off the cuff, what do you think our next step is? I think the more we get together, the more we can encircle each other with acceptance and compassion. That doesn't sound very legal, but that's actually what's transforming the law right now. What are your thoughts? What's our next?
I would also like to see thoughts in the comments. I mean, we have, you know, over 100 people attending today. If folks have thoughts, please make sure to type it in the comments. Arthi, were you going to add something?
Well, it's interesting because, first of all, just really appreciate everyone's comments today. And I have been learning about restorative justice because we've been putting it forward as one of the solutions to address anti-Asian hate. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is our criminal legal system is set up in a way. One of the learnings is, you know, victims think that prosecutors represent them initially, and then they learn they represent the state. And so they're actually not even, that actually gets in the way of their healing. One of the things that they really want is an acknowledgement of the pain and the harm. And the way our system is set up as oppositional, that is very hard for a perpetrator to give without potentially, you know, making themselves more vulnerable to, you know, I guess, incarceration. And so, like, how do we do that? How do we move from a system that actually, where victims are left incredibly dissatisfied after following something for a couple of years, not even understanding the legal processes and not feeling heard or seen or whole, right? And so I think, you know, these are questions for all of us. We might not be all, I'm not a criminal lawyer, but like, I would love for you know, those of us who are engaged on these issues to think about that and how we shift our current systems.
All right. Well, if there are no questions in the chat, or Dr. Rodriguez, if you want add anything else?
I guess I would just say, I just want to lift up the one comment that was made about bringing more circle into our spaces. And, you know, I understand sometimes people want something big when it comes to next steps, but I do think that, especially because, you know, some of my earlier research was really also around just kind of American apartheid and kind of segregation, and the fact that so many of us really have very few opportunities to encounter one another, and kind of lifting up that notion of, you know, radical love that Tully shares, I do think that kind of breaking bread literally with one another as much as we can. I mean, that's hard now, but maybe things are shifting, but, really goes a long way because, particularly I think for Asian Americans, especially kind of my generation, I would say, and younger, there is a way that, uh, we are kind of bypassing urban kind of centers and settling immediately in the suburb, and the ways that the suburb is sort of created, it creates, it really delimits kind of who your kinds of community becomes. And it may seem, again, very, very basic and so simple, and yet somehow I do think that that's such an important starting point, that I can imagine, which is wonderful that all of you as lawyers are so organized, that you have an organization that can help facilitate these conversations. So many people don't have organizations. We don't have very many places in our communities to get involved and to connect with one another. Maybe if you're straight and you have children and you might be able to connect with other parents through the school system, right? But, or maybe, if you don't work in a nonprofit, if you don't work in other kinds of spaces, being able to advance sort of social justice or really do this work is hard. And so I think that, continuing to build our organizations and starting to do that work really of being in space with one another is so vital, I think, for, building those relationships for something else.
And can I just add briefly that perhaps the subject of a future program could be examples of restorative justice that address the kinds of concerns, Arthi, that you're talking about. I've had a federal prosecutor who has come to my class in restorative justice and talked about the career-changing and life-changing aspect because of restorative justice and the way it has gotten him to look at questions of prosecution and incarceration, and listening to the voice of the victim in a way that doesn't finger point and punish.
Well, on behalf of the AAPI Civil Rights Committee, thank you to all of our speakers today, to the Charles Houston Bar Association, and to all our co-sponsors. We hope to see all of you at our next AAPI CRC event.
Thank you. Thanks for hosting.